How can you talk about your personality in English?
I say I'm confident, kind, and hardworking.
How can you explain your favorite food?
I say it's spicy, tasty, and full of flavor.
How can you talk about your best friend?
I say my best friend is caring and funny.
How can you explain your morning routine?
I say it's simple and well organized.
How can you talk about your room?
I say it's neat, bright, and comfortable.
How can he talk about his city?
He says it's busy and full of life.
How can she explain her hairstyle?
She says it's long, shiny, and soft.
How can they talk about their school?
They say it's modern and full of good teachers.
How can it tell about the weather?
It shows that the weather is sunny and warm.
How can this book tell about success?
It says success comes from patience and hard work.
How can your teacher talk about good students?
She says they are punctual and focused.
How can your mother explain happiness?
She says happiness is being peaceful and thankful.
How can your father talk about his job?
He says it's hard but rewarding.
How can your friend talk about your personality?
He says you're calm and cheerful.
How can your boss talk about your work?
He says it's neat and professional.
How can your neighbor talk about your home?
He says it looks clean and beautiful.
How can your sister talk about your clothes?
She says they're simple yet stylish.
How can your brother talk about your voice?
He says it's soft and pleasant.
How can your classmate talk about your handwriting?
He says it's neat and readable.
How can your friend talk about your smile?
She says it's natural and bright.
How can people talk about a sunset?
They call it colorful and peaceful.
How can travelers talk about mountains?
They call them tall and stunning.
How can children talk about their toys?
They call them fun and colorful.
How can artists talk about colors?
They call them bright, dark, or light.
How can teachers talk about smart students?
They call them active and intelligent.
How can students talk about exams?
They call them tough but useful.
How can visitors talk about your country?
They call it beautiful and diverse.
How can doctors talk about good health?
They call it balance and strength.
How can tourists talk about beaches?
They call them peaceful and relaxing.
How can players talk about a great match?
They call it exciting and fun.
How can your cousin talk about his car?
He says it's fast and comfortable.
How can your aunt talk about your cooking?
She says it's delicious and light.
How can your uncle talk about your talent?
He says it's natural and impressive.
How can your friend talk about English?
He says it's global and powerful.
How can people talk about the night sky?
They call it dark and full of stars.
How can scientists talk about the ocean?
They call it deep and full of life.
How can students talk about their classroom?
They call it bright and comfortable.
How can your teacher talk about good pronunciation?
She says it's clear and natural.
How can parents talk about their children?
They say they're precious and innocent.
How can learners talk about English grammar?
They say it's tricky but interesting.
How can singers talk about their voice?
They call it powerful and smooth.
How can actors talk about their roles?
They call them emotional and real.
How can readers talk about a good book?
They call it engaging and inspiring.
How can writers talk about their stories?
They call them creative and meaningful.
How can people talk about love?
They call it pure and strong.
How can chefs talk about great food?
They call it fresh and flavorful.
How can students talk about holidays?
They call them relaxing and fun.
How can travelers talk about new places?
They call them beautiful and exciting.
How can friends talk about each other?
They say each one is loyal and kind.
How can people talk about music?
They call it soft, emotional, and powerful.
How can teachers talk about good habits?
They call them useful and important.
How can children talk about their parents?
They call them loving and caring.
How can players talk about winning?
They call it sweet and joyful.
How can tourists talk about deserts?
They call them dry and endless.
How can artists talk about their art?
They call it personal and emotional.
How can scientists talk about space?
They call it vast and mysterious.
How can photographers talk about nature?
They call it colorful and pure.
How can people talk about life?
They call it short but beautiful.
How can elders talk about youth?
They say it's full of energy.
How can teachers talk about discipline?
They call it the key to success.
How can friends talk about memories?
They call them sweet and special.
How can parents talk about love?
They call it endless and true.
How can farmers talk about rain?
They call it a blessing from heaven.
How can people talk about dreams?
They call them colorful and deep.
How can students talk about teachers?
They say they are helpful and wise.
How can children talk about cartoons?
They call them funny and exciting.
How can athletes talk about training?
They say it's hard but rewarding.
How can people talk about time?
They call it precious and fast.
How can workers talk about weekends?
They call them relaxing and happy.
How can travelers talk about cities?
They call them crowded and bright.
How can readers talk about poetry?
They call it deep and touching.
How can people talk about truth?
They call it pure and powerful.
How can leaders talk about teamwork?
They call it strength and unity.
How can children talk about games?
They call them fun and exciting.
How can singers talk about music?
They say it's life and emotion.
How can tourists talk about mountains?
They call them tall and peaceful.
How can people talk about kindness?
They call it gentle and rare.
How can students talk about English?
They call it useful and global.
How can speakers talk about confidence?
They call it the secret to success.
How can painters talk about colors?
They call them bright and full of life.
How can people talk about mornings?
They call them fresh and beautiful.
How can travelers talk about roads?
They call them long and adventurous.
How can teachers talk about goals?
They call them clear and reachable.
How can friends talk about jokes?
They call them funny and silly.
How can writers talk about words?
They call them powerful and magical.
How can students talk about practice?
They call it the path to progress.
How can people talk about peace?
They call it calm and priceless.
How can scientists talk about energy?
They call it strong and invisible.
How can doctors talk about sleep?
They call it natural and healing.
How can people talk about honesty?
They call it rare and valuable.
How can teachers talk about learning?
They call it endless and beautiful.